Cybersource platform's developer tools are a set of resources designed to help you and your development teams create, test, and debug our API offerings needed to meet your business requirements. Let's explore these tools and how they can help you. One of our developer experience platform's most powerful tool is a developer sandbox. It is essentially a testing environment that isolates changes made by untested code, allowing your development teams to experiment and learn. This eliminates the need for separate environment for testing for feasibility and evaluation purposes. Additionally, the sandbox saves all the data caused by test activities, allowing persistence of the environment. By default, our platform comes with a public sandbox account, allowing the developers to avoid having to create one, but they're also able to create their own sandbox account if necessary. Let's dive into our API reference on the Developer Center, which contains the following. Our API reference contains an overview of every API product we offer, the endpoint information. It has a request builder section, which helps you and developers set up the request body by adding or removing properties. The live console it shows a set of sample requests related to the endpoint. The response box also contains the REST API call responses along with the response code that the API call is able to return. A developer center also allows you to create your own merchant ID. A merchant ID is the platform unique identifier, and it's needed to perform transaction and make calls from your own individual account to all available API products. When a sandbox account is created, developers will need to provide a merchant ID. If it needs to be changed, they must deactivate the account and register a new one, since merchant IDs cannot be modified. A merchant ID is also necessary to generate a merchant's own API authentication keys. This will assure that every API call is initiated by an authentic source from the merchant. There are two ways of authenticating yourself in API calls. The first one is HTTP signature authentication, which consists of signing the HTTP headers with a shared secret key. Before making any API call, the shared secret key needs to be generated. This can be done by using the merchant ID, either through our Business Center portal, and it can be generated for both our sandbox and production environment. The second authentication method that works with our REST API calls is JSON Web Token or the JWT token. A P12 certificate is used to sign the authorization HTTP header. The merchant ID is also necessary to generate the P12 certificate. To use the private merchant ID instead of the default one in the live console, the generated keys for JWT and HTTP signature authentication methods can be entered by the developer. A payment processor is the system that performs the actual transaction using data provided from a payment gateway. When the payments API call has been executed, our platform lets our developers specify from a wide range of types which payment processor should be applied. Payment processor type can be selected in the live console, which allows the user to inspect the behavior of different payment processor fields and test data set. Our platform offers full access to software development kits collection, and you can visit it from our API menu. In order to obtain SDKs or sample codes, you may choose for SDKs. Packages can be added into target projects employing the repository corresponding to the chosen language. For example, if we pick Java, we can include in the POM file the dependency from Maven repository. If the selection is Node.js, we can install the dependency from NPM. For sample codes, since they're hosted in GitHub, it is sufficient to clone them into a local machine. Additionally, GitHub repositories allow you to download the entire sample code project. Once you as developers have a copy of the sample project in your local machine, you will need to configure it before running it. This configuration consists of setting the API credentials and will vary depending on the chosen authentication method. Let's review which parameters. For HTTP signature authentication method, we will need to set the following parameters. Authentication type field, in which we need to assign the HTTP_signature value. Merchant ID field, in which we will need to set your merchant ID field. Merchant key ID, in which we need to assign the ID that represents the shared secret key. Merchant secret key, in which we need to set the shared secret key itself. Use meta key and enable client cert, which needs to be false. For the JWT authentication method, we need to set the following parameters. Authentication type field, in which we will need to assign the JWT value. Merchant ID field, like the HTTP signature method, key alias, key password, key file name, all need to have the merchant ID assigned to them. Key directory field, in which we need to set the resources value. Use meta key and enable client cert, like the HTTP signature method, which needs to be false. After the configuration, we're ready to run the sample codes, which can be done in 3 ways. The first way is by using the intelligent IDE. First, we need to open the folder containing the sample codes. Then we build the project by clicking Rebuild Project from the Build menu. We can then pick the example we want to run. For instance, simple authorization internet, for which we need to right-click and select Run. The second way you could run a sample code is by using Eclipse IDE. We need to import the sample code as a Maven project, then compile it. In order to do this, we can run it as Maven build specifying clean install in the goals field. Once the project compile is completed, and similar to IntelliJ, we can pick our desired example and right-click Run. In case we don't have Eclipse or IntelliJ as available IDs, we can run any sample code we want just using the console. We can open the command prompt console from the operating system we are using, then navigate to the project directory and execute a Maven compile, specifying which example we want to run once the compile is finished. As an example, we can type mvn compile exec:/java and the following code, which will run authorization with capture sale once the compilation is completed. Now let's run the $0 authentication class, which is useful to test the integration with our platform, since the example will try to execute an authorization with a $0 amount. We'll also explore the response once the call is completed. First, we need to open a console, then navigate to the folder where the sample codes are located. Then, we need to run the Maven compile command, indicating that the $0 authentication class must be executed when the compile is finished. After running the example, the console will show the response, in which we can see the transaction was authorized, as well as the transaction ID, the reconciliation ID, date and time of the transaction, and other useful data. As part of our developer experience platform, we also provide a set of Postman examples, which can be imported to the Postman app or run in the web version of Postman. Let's explore a use case where a customer successfully buys a green carpet, then shortly after decides they don't want it but want a blue one instead. Let's examine which Postman examples we need to run in order to go through each step of the use case. First, we need to authorize the sale amount, which is $100 USD. For this, we can run the authorization only Postman example, which among other data will return the transaction ID and link that the developer can use to make the capture. We can observe that the return response points to our payments API endpoint for capture, which means that executing a call to that endpoint providing the authorization transaction ID will perform a capture for us. Second, we will run the API call to execute the capture. We can complete this by using the response we obtained from the first step, or by recurring to the capture payment Postman example, where we will need to specify the transaction ID from the first step. As a response, we get a different transaction ID and we can see that the transaction is in pending status. Third, the customer expresses that they want a blue carpet instead, which costs $50 USD. What we need to use here in this example is the refund endpoint. This example, we need to set the amount to 50 USD in the API body and then append the transaction ID from the second step into the API endpoint. Once we run the request, we will get the response which will indicate that the transaction is complete. The merchant can periodically check the status of both transactions using the transaction detail example, appending the corresponding transaction ID to the API endpoint. As a conclusion, we learned that the platform offers a set of resources called developer tools whose goal is to assist development teams while they work with our platform APIs. These resources include our Developer Center, which is publicly available site, the Postman collection, the SDKs for 6 programming languages, SDKs with sample codes ready to be cloned, compiled, and executed, the ability to create merchant's own unique sandbox account, a live API reference with support for JWT, HTTP signature authentication methods, and much more.